The wind howled through the jagged peaks of the Greyfong Mountains, carrying with it the biting chill of winter's approach. In the heart of this desolate wilderness, far from the reaches of civilization, stood a crumbling stone keep. Once a proud bastion of strength and power, it now lay forgotten, much like its only inhabitant, Kael Blood-Red. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames as though searching for answers. His reflection flickered in the dim light, the glow casting an eerie red hue on his pale, gaunt face. His eyes, once sharp and full of life, now bore the weariness of a man who had fought too many battles, both with others and within himself. His hands, still strong, twitched involuntarily, a subtle reminder of the ever-growing hunger gnawing at his soul. The hunger had been his constant companion for years. It lurked in the back of his mind, whispering dark promises, taunting him with thoughts of blood. He fought it daily, but the struggle was becoming harder. Each time he denied it, the beast within him grew stronger. Kael was the last of his clan. The Blood-Red, they were called, once warriors of unmatched prowess, feared and respected throughout the lands. Their banner had flown high in the days of old, its crimson hue a testament to their love of battle, their thirst for conquest. But that thirst had been their undoing. The blood they spilled in battle was not enough to sate their hunger, and their endless pursuit of power caught the attention of something far older, far darker. Kael closed his eyes, trying to block out the memories, but they came anyway, like they always did. He could still hear the war cries of his ancestors, the clash of steel, the wet sound of swords cleaving flesh. He remembered standing shoulder to shoulder with his kin, drenched in the blood of their enemies. The rush of battle had been intoxicating, filling him with a sense of invincibility. He had loved the fight, the thrill of combat. But all that had changed the day the curse took hold. The stories had been whispered for generations. An old deity, forgotten by most, had watched the rise of the Blood-Red clan with disdain. Tharon, the god of bloodfire, who thrived on sacrifice and carnage, had decided that their arrogance must be punished. In their final battle, one that was meant to cement their rule over the northern territories, Tharon appeared. His form was shrouded in flames, his eyes burning with hatred. He spoke but one word, "Vampire." Kael could still hear that word echoing in his mind, spoken with such venom that it reverberated through his very bones. From that moment, the curse had been set. His father, mother, brothers, and sisters had all fallen, one by one, to the dark hunger that now consumed them. They had transformed into creatures of the night, no longer warriors, but monsters driven by an insatiable need for blood. He had watched his family turn, their once proud faces twisted into snarls, their eyes gleaming with the thirst. They had become predators in the truest sense, hunting the weak, draining the life from anything that crossed their path. And in time, they had turned on one another, driven mad by the hunger that they could not control. Kael had fled, abandoning the once glorious stronghold that was his home. For years he wandered, searching for a way to break the curse, for a way to rid himself of the bloodlust that now tainted his soul. But no matter how far he traveled, no matter how many ancient texts he studied, no matter how many seers and mystics he sought out, there was no salvation. The curse was unbreakable, or so it seemed. Now, years later, he found himself alone, living as little more than a hermit, hiding in the mountains, far from the world of men. But the hunger followed him, its whispers becoming louder, more insistent. As the fire crackled before him, Kael's mind drifted to his mother, the last victim of the curse before him. She had been strong, a warrior queen who led her people with wisdom and ferocity. But even she had succumbed. He had watched her transformation, her slow descent into madness. Her eyes, once filled with love for her son, had grown cold and predatory. In her final moments, she had called out to him, not as his mother, but as a monster. "Kael," she had whispered, her voice thick with the blood of the last unfortunate soul who had crossed her path. "It's only a matter of time." That vision returned to him now, clear as day, even though it had been years since her passing. He could still see her, standing before him, her body twisted and gaunt, her once golden hair matted with blood. Her eyes glowed in the firelight, and her lips curled into a smile that was more of a snarl. "It's only a matter of time." Kael shuddered, shaking the memory away, but he knew she was right. Time was running out. His control was slipping, and soon, there would be nothing left of the man he once was, only the beast. He could already feel it, the subtle shifts in his behavior. He was quicker to anger now, more reckless in his moments of solitude. The nights were the worst, the hunger gnawing at him, whispering for him to leave the mountains and find prey. But he had to resist. He couldn't let himself become what his family had. He couldn't become the monster that Tharon had condemned him to be. There had to be a way out. There had to be hope. A sudden gust of wind blew through the keep, snuffing out the fire. Kael stood, his heart pounding as the darkness enveloped him. The wind outside seemed to howl louder, and for a moment, he thought he heard something in it. Something more than just the cry of the storm. A voice, a whisper. "Kael." He turned, his eyes scanning the shadows, but there was nothing. Still, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He knew that voice. It was his mother's. Her words echoed in the silence, and with them came the cold, bone-deep realization that he couldn't hide forever. The curse was coming for him, as it had for the others. The morning after the vision of his mother, Kael stood at the edge of the Greyfong Mountains, looking down at the vast wilderness below. The world stretched out before him like a sea of shadows, the dense forests blanketed in mist. It had been years since he had left the isolation of his keep, but now there was no other choice. He had to find Yseult the Druid, the last living member of an ancient order that held the secrets of divine curses. If anyone could break the chains of his bloodline's torment, it was her. His supplies were meager, just enough to survive the journey. He strapped a sword to his side, its blade dulled from disuse but still reliable, and fastened his worn cloak tightly against the cold winds. The air tasted of frost, and every breath he took felt like an effort to resist the hunger that clawed at him from within. As he descended from the mountains into the thick, untamed forests below, the world around him seemed to shift. The shadows between the trees grew longer, darker, as if something ancient stirred within the woods. The further Kael ventured, the heavier the air became, filled with a sense of foreboding. Days passed in silence, his journey marked only by the distant howls of wolves and the constant reminder of the curse festering inside him. He felt it growing stronger with each step, the bloodlust gnawing at his mind. His dreams were filled with red, violent, vivid images of battles, of flesh torn open, of blood staining his hands. When he awoke, drenched in cold sweat, his heart would race with a hunger he fought desperately to suppress. But there was no suppressing the darkness in the Shadowvale forest. The woods, as legend told, were home to creatures that thrived on the fears of men, and Kael could feel their eyes on him, watching from the darkness. He moved swiftly, keeping his senses sharp, though his strength was waning. The hunger grew louder, more demanding, and each time he passed through a village, he avoided the temptation of the people he saw, their scent calling to him like a siren's song. It was on the third night in the Shadowvale that Kael's resolve was tested. The moon hung low, casting long beams of light through the forest canopy. Kael's campfire flickered weakly, and the only sound was the crackling of embers. He sat alone, staring into the flames, but something, an itch at the back of his mind, warned him he was not alone. Then it came, the sound of heavy, wet footsteps. Kael's hand instinctively went to his sword hilt, his eyes scanning the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, closer, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that rumbled like a storm on the horizon. His blood pounded in his ears, the hunger stirring within him, urging him to act, to strike before he became prey. From the shadows it emerged. The creature was hunched and massive, its body covered in leathery black skin that glistened in the moonlight. Its eyes burned with unnatural light, glowing red as it lumbered toward Kael. Its fangs, long and jagged, dripped with saliva, and the stench of rot emanated from it like a physical force. Kael drew his sword in one swift motion, but as he did, a voice, deep and cruel, echoed through the clearing, stopping him in his tracks. "Blood-Red," the creature hissed, its voice like broken glass grinding against stone. "The last of your kind." Kael's breath caught in his throat. This demon knew him, knew his bloodline. The beast circled slowly, its claws scraping against the forest floor. "You smell of blood," it continued, savoring the words. "But you do not feed. Why do you deny what you are?" Kael's grip tightened on his sword. "I am not like the others," he said through gritted teeth. "I will not become what they became." The demon let out a laugh, a sound that sent chills down Kael's spine. "You already are, child. Your blood sings with it, calls for it, and you are running from it." Kael's mind raced. He had faced creatures of darkness before, but none like this. There was something ancient in its gaze, something that had witnessed countless lives fall to madness. "You are at war with yourself," the creature whispered, its voice weaving into the air like a spell. "But the war is lost. The hunger will consume you, unless—" It paused, licking its lips with a grotesque, elongated tongue. "Unless you give in." Kael felt his heart thunder in his chest, the beast's words striking too close to the truth. His blood boiled, his vision blurred with flashes of crimson. The hunger, always just beneath the surface, surged. He could hear it in his mind, the call to feed, to release the growing storm inside him. "I will not fall," Kael said, but his voice wavered. The creature grinned, its fangs gleaming in the moonlight. "You will, or you will die. It is your nature, Blood-Red. You cannot fight it forever. Accept what you are. Embrace it, or descend into madness. Those are your only choices." Kael lunged forward, his sword slashing through the air. The creature dodged with terrifying speed, its laughter echoing in the dark as it toyed with him. Each strike Kael made felt more desperate, more erratic, as if the beast was not only fighting him physically, but mentally, draining his will to resist. "Why do you fight what you are?" it taunted. "You are a predator, not a man. Feed, drink, and become what your blood demands." Kael roared in frustration, his movements growing reckless as the hunger tore at him. For a brief moment, he faltered, the beast's words sinking in. What was he fighting for? His humanity? The curse would take that from him regardless, wouldn't it? Was it inevitable that he would become a monster like his family? The demon struck then, slashing across Kael's chest, throwing him to the ground. His sword clattered away, and the creature loomed over him, its foul breath filling his nostrils. "It is time, Blood-Red," the beast growled. "Choose." Kael lay there, panting, his body aching from the blow. The demon's words echoed in his mind. He could feel the bloodlust rising, pushing at the edges of his consciousness. His throat burned with thirst. His hands twitched with the desire to kill, to feed. But deep within him, something else stirred. Something faint, but undeniable. "No!" Kael whispered, his voice weak but defiant. The creature paused, surprised. Kael gritted his teeth and pushed himself to his knees. "I will not let this curse define me." The demon's grin faded, replaced by a snarl. "Then you are a fool." Kael's hand shot out, grabbing his sword. With a surge of strength, he thrust the blade upward, driving it deep into the creature's abdomen. The demon howled in agony, its blood, thick and black, gushing from the wound. Kael twisted the blade, pulling it free in one swift motion as the beast staggered back, collapsing into the shadows from whence it came. Kael fell to one knee, gasping for breath, his chest burning with pain. The hunger still roared inside him, but he had resisted, for now. As the forest fell silent, Kael wiped the blood from his sword and sheathed it. The creature's words haunted him. Was he truly doomed to fall to the curse? Could he ever truly resist the hunger? The path to Yseult was still long, and the shadow of doubt loomed over him. But he had made his choice, for now at least. He would fight. No matter how strong the call of the shadow became, he would not surrender to the beast within. The city of Bastion was once a symbol of human resilience, a bulwark against the darkness that lurked at the fringes of the world. Now it was a crumbling husk of its former self, tainted by the very forces it had once sought to hold back. As Kael descended from the forests into the desolate valley where Bastion lay, he could feel the weight of the city's corruption pressing down on him like a suffocating shroud. Bastion's walls were jagged and worn, covered in a sickly green moss that pulsed faintly in the dying light. The streets, once bustling with life, were empty save for the occasional shadow that flitted between the broken buildings. The air smelled of rot and decay, and a thick fog clung to the ground, swirling around Kael's boots as he made his way through the city gates. Kael had heard stories of Bastion's fall, of how the city had succumbed to dark magic in its final days. Some said that a powerful sorcerer had cursed the city. Others whispered of demons that walked its streets, feeding on the souls of the unwary. Whatever the truth, it was clear that Bastion was no longer a place of sanctuary. It had become a graveyard for those who had once called it home. Kael moved cautiously, his senses on high alert. He could feel eyes watching him from the shadows, but none dared approach. The presence of magic here was palpable, a thick, almost tangible force that clung to every corner of the city. It weighed on him, feeding the hunger inside him, stirring the curse within his veins. He pulled his cloak tighter around him and pressed forward, determined to find the guild of assassins that had made Bastion their home. It was said that the guild held knowledge of ancient blood pacts, dark dealings that could unravel the mystery of his clan's curse. If anyone knew the true origin of his family's torment, it would be them. As night fell, Kael reached the heart of the city. The buildings here were taller, more intact, but their windows were dark, and the streets were eerily silent. He approached a narrow alleyway, the entrance marked by a symbol he had been told to look for. A blood-red dagger etched into the stone wall. It was the mark of the guild. Taking a deep breath, Kael stepped into the shadows of the alley, the fog swirling around his legs as he moved deeper into the labyrinthine passageways. The air grew colder, and the sound of his footsteps echoed unnaturally in the silence. After what felt like hours, Kael reached a heavy iron door, worn and rusted from years of neglect. He raised his hand to knock, but before he could, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a dimly lit chamber beyond. Kael hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The chamber was vast, lined with stone pillars that stretched up into the darkness above. At the far end of the room sat a long wooden table, around which several figures were gathered. Their faces were hidden by hoods, but their eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, watched Kael with a predatory intensity. "You've come," said one of the figures, a woman with a voice like velvet, but edged with steel. "We've been expecting you." Kael stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "I've come for answers," he said, his voice firm despite the tension in the room. "About my clan, about the curse." The woman's lips curled into a faint smile, though her eyes remained cold. "The Blood-Red clan," she said softly. "Warriors once revered, now feared and hunted like beasts. Your name carries a heavy weight here." The other figures at the table shifted uncomfortably, as though the mere mention of Kael's family was enough to stir old ghosts. "Do you know the origin of the curse?" Kael asked, his gaze hardening. "Why my family was condemned?" The woman stood, her movements slow and deliberate. "You seek knowledge that most would rather forget," she said, her eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "Your curse is not the simple vengeance of a god. It is the result of a pact, one made long before you were born." Kael's heart pounded in his chest, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "The Blood-Red clan made a deal with Tharon, the god of bloodfire," she explained, her voice echoing through the chamber. "They sought immortality, power that would ensure their dominance for generations. Tharon granted them their wish, but at a cost. The bloodlust that courses through your veins is not just a curse, but the fulfillment of that pact. You are bound to Tharon's will, just as your ancestors were." Kael's blood ran cold at her words. "They sold their souls for power," he muttered, disgusted by the thought. "And now we all suffer for it." The woman nodded. "Your ancestors thought they could control the power they were given. But Tharon is not a god to be controlled. The hunger you feel, the bloodlust, is his gift, and it will consume you, just as it consumed them." Kael clenched his fists. "There must be a way to break the pact, to free myself from this curse." At this, the woman's smile faded, replaced by a look of caution. "There is no simple way to undo what was done, but there may be a path, dangerous and uncertain, that could sever your connection to Tharon." Before she could say more, one of the other figures spoke up, his voice rough and full of contempt. "You're a fool, Ezra," he spat, rising from his seat. "We should kill him now before he brings more death to this city." Kael's hand tightened on his sword, but he did not draw it. The assassin's words stirred the others, and several of them murmured in agreement, their eyes narrowing with suspicion and fear. "He is a Blood-Red," the man continued, stepping toward Kael. "His kind are nothing but monsters. If we let him live, we doom ourselves." Ezra raised a hand, silencing the man. "Enough, Tharon," she said, her voice sharp. "He came here seeking answers, not violence." Tharon sneered, his eyes flicking toward Kael. "Answers won't save us when he loses control and slaughters us all." Kael could feel the tension rising, the room closing in around him. The hunger inside him stirred at the scent of fear, but he forced it back, refusing to give in. "If you want to try," Kael said quietly, his voice cold as steel, "you'll find I'm not so easy to kill." Tharon's eyes flared with anger, but Ezra stepped between them, her gaze locking onto Kael's. "You are not like the others in your clan," she said softly, her tone calming the room. "But the curse is strong, and the path you walk is treacherous. If you wish to break the bond with Tharon, you must confront him. Face the very deity who gave your family its power." Kael's breath caught in his throat. Face Tharon? The idea seemed impossible. Tharon was a god, an ancient force of destruction. How could he hope to confront such a being? Ezra seemed to sense his doubt and stepped closer. "There is a place," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A forgotten temple where Tharon once walked among mortals. If you can reach it, you may have a chance. But know this, the price for freedom may be higher than you can imagine." Kael met her gaze, his resolve hardening. He had come this far, faced horrors beyond imagining, and still he stood. If confronting Tharon was his only chance, then he would take it, no matter the cost. But before he could respond, Tharon moved again, drawing a dagger from his belt. "No," he growled, his face twisted with rage. "I won't let you unleash this monster on us." In an instant, the room erupted into chaos. Tharon lunged at Kael, his blade flashing in the dim light. Kael moved swiftly, drawing his sword and deflecting the blow. Their weapons clashed, the sound echoing through the chamber like thunder. Tharon was fast, his attacks precise, but Kael's strength, and the curse within him, gave him an edge. With a swift movement, he knocked Tharon's dagger aside and brought his sword to the assassin's throat. "Enough," Kael said, his voice a low growl. "I am not your enemy." Tharon froze, his eyes wide with fear. But before Kael could lower his blade, Ezra spoke. "Let him go," she said, her voice steady. "We are not your enemies, Kael. But know this, if you fail to control the curse, if you fall to the bloodlust, we will be forced to stop you." Kael hesitated for a moment before lowering his sword, the room falling into an uneasy silence. Ezra stepped forward, her eyes locking onto his. "Go to the temple," she said softly. "Find Tharon, and may whatever gods still watch over this cursed land guide your path." Kael nodded, his resolve firm. The path before him was dark, but he would not turn back. The shadows of his past, and the horrors left behind by his clan, were no longer something he could outrun. Kael wandered through the wilderness, each step growing heavier as the weight of the revelations about his clan pressed down on him. The world around him was a blur of mist and shadow, the distant trees twisted and gnarled like the fingers of the dead. The whispers in his mind had grown louder since his time in Bastion, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. The visions that haunted him were relentless, and with every passing moment, he felt the grip of bloodlust tightening around his soul. As he walked, the visions began to creep in again. Phantom figures emerging from the fog, clad in the armor of the Blood-Red clan. Their faces were gaunt, hollow-eyed, their mouths twisted into grotesque snarls as they tore through battlefields, drenched in blood. Kael saw his ancestors slaughtering without mercy, their swords cutting through flesh and bone as if driven by an insatiable hunger. They were warriors once, but in these visions, they had become monsters, creatures who reveled in the slaughter, who sought the blood of both enemy and ally alike. Kael stopped in his tracks, clutching his head as the voices of the dead began to echo in his mind, their words indistinguishable yet filled with malice. "This is your fate. You will become what we became. The hunger will consume you." Kael's breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to push the voices away, but they were relentless. His vision blurred, and suddenly, he found himself standing in the middle of a battlefield long forgotten, the ground soaked with the blood of fallen warriors. He recognized the banners of the Blood-Red clan, torn and tattered, flying over the carnage. The scent of blood filled his nostrils, sharp and metallic, and he could feel the hunger rising again, threatening to overwhelm him. "No!" Kael growled, his voice strained as he clenched his fists. "I will not become like them." But the vision did not relent. One of the spectral warriors turned to face him, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It stepped forward, dragging its blood-stained sword behind it, leaving a trail of crimson in its wake. "We are you, Kael," the warrior hissed. "You cannot escape us. You are bound to this curse, just as we were. The blood calls to you." Kael shook his head, backing away. "I am not like you. I will not fall." The warrior grinned, its teeth sharp and gleaming. "You will. You already feel it, don't you? The hunger. It gnaws at you. Every battle, every wound, brings you closer to us. You cannot fight it forever." Kael's heart pounded in his chest, and the ground beneath him began to shift, warping into a grotesque reflection of his inner turmoil. The battlefield twisted into a nightmarish landscape, the bodies of the fallen rising, their eyes filled with malice. They reached for him, their cold hands grasping at his cloak, pulling him toward the blood-soaked earth. Suddenly, the vision shattered, and Kael was back in the forest, gasping for breath, his hands shaking. His sword felt heavy at his side, as if it carried the weight of every life it had taken. He sank to his knees, his mind reeling from the onslaught of madness. He had fought so long to resist the curse, but it was becoming harder with each passing day. The bloodlust was no longer a distant whisper. It was a roar, a constant demand that he could barely control. But he had no choice. He had to find Yseult the Druid, the last hope he had to break the curse before it consumed him completely. After days of wandering, Kael finally found the Druid in a hidden grove deep within the forest. The air here was different, thick with the scent of herbs and ancient magic. The trees grew tall and twisted, their bark etched with runes that pulsed faintly in the fading light. In the center of the grove stood Yseult, her figure cloaked in a robe of deep green, her long silver hair cascading down her back. Her eyes were old, older than any mortal should be, and they glimmered with knowledge that spanned centuries. "You have come," Yseult said without turning to face him, her voice soft yet commanding. "The last of the Blood-Red clan." Kael stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "You know why I'm here," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "The curse, the bloodlust, I need to know how to stop it." Yseult turned slowly, her gaze piercing through him as if she could see the very depths of his soul. "You are walking a dangerous path, Kael. The blood that runs through your veins is not merely cursed. It is bound to a power older than the gods themselves." Kael felt a shiver run down his spine. "You know about the pact," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Yseult nodded. "Yes, your ancestors, in their thirst for power, made a bargain with Tharon, the god of bloodfire. They sought immortality, and in return, they bound themselves to his will. The curse you carry is the price of that pact." Kael clenched his fists, frustration bubbling to the surface. "There must be a way to break it. You must know something." Yseult studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "The only way to break the curse is to confront Tharon himself. But that path is fraught with peril. The further you walk it, the more you lose of yourself." Kael's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Yseult's expression darkened. "With every battle, every drop of blood you spill, the curse tightens its hold on you. The more you fight, the more you feed the hunger inside you. And with each victory, you lose a piece of your humanity. Eventually, there will be nothing left but the beast." Kael felt his stomach twist with dread. He had known, deep down, that the curse was eroding his soul, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. "Then what am I supposed to do?" he asked, his voice trembling with desperation. "How can I fight this if fighting is what dooms me?" Yseult stepped closer, her eyes softening with sympathy. "You must choose your battles carefully, Kael. The path ahead will test not just your strength, but your will. Tharon will tempt you with power, with the promise of release from the hunger. But it is a lie. Every step closer to him will bring you closer to losing yourself." Kael clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He had come so far, endured so much, but now it felt as though every choice he made led him further into darkness. Could he truly face a god and hope to remain whole? Or would the curse consume him before he ever had the chance? Yseult's voice broke through his thoughts. "You are on the verge of losing yourself, Kael. I can see it in your eyes. The madness is close, but there is still hope. You are not yet beyond saving." Kael looked at her, his face twisted with doubt. "And if I fail?" Yseult's expression was grave. "Then you will become like your ancestors, a monster, driven by bloodlust, a slave to Tharon's will." Kael swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a crushing force. His hands shook, and he could feel the hunger gnawing at him, demanding to be fed. The whispers of the dead echoed in his mind, tempting him, pulling him toward the darkness. But he could not give in. Not yet. There was still a chance, however small, that he could break free from the curse. He had to believe that. "I won't let that happen," Kael said, his voice firm despite the turmoil inside him. "I will confront Tharon. I will break the curse." Yseult nodded, though her eyes were filled with sorrow. "Then you must prepare yourself for the hardest battle of all, the battle for your soul. Tharon is cunning, and he will use every weakness you have against you." Kael's jaw tightened. "I am ready." But even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. The madness was closer than ever, and he could feel his grip on reality slipping. Every day, every moment, was a struggle to hold on to what remained of his humanity. As Kael turned to leave the grove, Yseult's voice echoed one final warning. Remember, Kael, each battle you fight brings you closer to the edge. Choose wisely, or you will lose yourself before you ever face Tharon. The forest closed in around him as he walked away, the shadows whispering his name, the hunger ever present. The journey ahead was long, and the path darker than ever. But Kael knew there was no turning back now. His only hope lay in facing the very god who had cursed his bloodline, and he feared that when the time came, he might not have the strength to resist the pull of the darkness within him. The path to the Abyss of Mirrors was shrouded in mist, a winding trail through an ancient forest where the trees whispered secrets too old to comprehend. The moon hung high above, its pale light casting an eerie glow on the twisting branches and the gnarled roots that seemed to reach out like claws from the earth. Kael followed Yseult in silence, his thoughts dark and heavy, haunted by the knowledge that the trial awaiting him could very well decide his fate. They had walked for hours, and the further they went, the more oppressive the air became. Kael could feel the pull of the abyss, a strange, foreboding presence that weighed on his soul. The voices in his head had quieted, replaced by an unnerving silence that filled him with dread. He knew that the Abyss of Mirrors was not just a place. It was a test, a reflection of the deepest, darkest parts of his soul. "This is where the souls of the damned wander," Yseult said softly as they neared the edge of the forest. "The lost, the forsaken, those who have been consumed by the blood curse." Kael swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the shimmering mist ahead. Beyond it lay the abyss, a place where reality and madness intertwined. The thought of facing what lurked there sent a chill down his spine, but he had no choice. This was the only way forward. Yseult stopped just before the threshold, her eyes filled with sorrow. "This is as far as I can go," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "The Abyss of Mirrors is a place only you can enter. It is a reflection of your soul, Kael. What you see there will be a manifestation of your darkest fears, your most dangerous impulses." Kael nodded, though his heart pounded in his chest. "What will I find in there?" Yseult's expression darkened. "A reflection of yourself, but not as you are, as you might become. The bloodlust inside you will take form, and you will be forced to confront it. If you falter, if you give in to the hunger, you will lose yourself completely." Kael's grip tightened on his sword, his knuckles white. He had fought so long to keep the curse at bay, but the temptation was always there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when he would finally give in. The thought of facing that version of himself, twisted, monstrous, filled him with dread. "How do I defeat it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Yseult's gaze softened, but there was no comfort in her words. "The answer lies within you, but know this: victory will not come without a price. The key to breaking the curse requires a sacrifice." Kael's breath caught in his throat. "What kind of sacrifice?" Yseult looked away, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "That is something only you can discover, but the cost will be great." Kael felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had come this far, endured so much, but now the stakes were higher than ever. The line between who he was and the monster he feared becoming had never felt thinner. "Go," Yseult said quietly, "and remember, whatever you see in the abyss, whatever darkness you face, do not forget who you are." With those final words, Yseult stepped back, leaving Kael to face the abyss alone. Taking a deep breath, Kael stepped forward into the swirling mist. The world around him shifted and twisted, the ground beneath his feet feeling both solid and insubstantial at the same time. The air was thick with the scent of blood and decay, and Kael's heart raced as he felt the presence of someone, watching him from the shadows. Ahead, the mist parted to reveal a vast, mirror-like surface stretching endlessly in all directions. The abyss of mirrors was not a place of stone or earth. It was a void, a realm where reality itself was fractured and distorted. The surface of the abyss reflected everything around it, but the reflections were warped, twisted versions of the truth. As Kael stepped closer, his reflection appeared in the mirrored surface. But it wasn't him. It was a version of him, pale and gaunt, with eyes that gleamed red like embers in the darkness. His reflection skin was sickly white, stretched tight over sharp bones, and his mouth twisted into a cruel smile that revealed fangs stained with blood. The sight sent a wave of revulsion through Kael, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew what this was, his dark double, the vampiric version of himself that he had fought to keep at bay, the monster that he might become. "You," Kael said, his voice steady though his heart thundered in his chest. "I've been waiting for this." The reflection tilted its head, its eyes narrowing with amusement. "Have you?" it whispered, its voice a mocking echo of Kael's own. "I've always been here, Kael, lurking in the shadows, waiting for you to let me in." Kael drew his sword, the weight of it familiar and comforting in his hand. "I won't let you take me," he said firmly. "I'm still in control." The reflection chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Are you? How many battles have you fought? How many times have you felt the hunger growing inside you? You've already given in, Kael. You just don't want to admit it." Kael gritted his teeth, stepping closer to the mirrored surface. "I'm not like you." The reflection's smile widened, revealing more of its fangs. "Not yet, but soon. You can feel it, can't you? The bloodlust, the hunger, calls to you. Every time you kill, every time you spill blood, it grows stronger. You can't fight it forever." Kael lunged at the reflection, his sword cutting through the air with deadly precision. But the reflection moved just as quickly, matching Kael's movements with an eerie, supernatural grace. Their blades clashed, the sound ringing out across the void as they fought. The battle was swift and brutal, the reflection's movements mirroring Kael's perfectly. It was like fighting a shadow. Every strike Kael made, the reflection countered with equal force. But as the fight wore on, Kael began to feel the strain. His arms grew heavy, his breath ragged, and the hunger inside him gnawed at his resolve. "You can't win," the reflection hissed, its red eyes gleaming with malice. "You're already losing yourself. Every swing of your sword, every drop of blood spilled, it's only bringing you closer to me." Kael's vision blurred as the bloodlust surged within him. His muscles ached, his throat dry with thirst. He could feel the darkness closing in, threatening to swallow him whole. The reflection pressed the attack, its strikes faster, more vicious, as if feeding off Kael's growing despair. "Give in," it whispered, its voice like poison in Kael's mind. "Embrace what you are. Stop fighting. Let the hunger consume you." Kael stumbled, his sword slipping from his grasp as he fell to one knee. The reflection loomed over him, its fangs gleaming in the pale light of the abyss. "This is who you are," it said softly, crouching down to meet Kael's gaze. "A monster, just like the rest of your clan." Kael's heart raced, his mind a whirlwind of fear and doubt. The reflection's words echoed in his mind, twisting his thoughts, making him question everything. Was this truly his fate? Was he destined to become the very thing he had fought so hard to resist? But then, in the depths of his despair, a single thought pierced through the darkness, a memory. His mother's face, her voice, the last words she had spoken to him before the curse claimed her. "You are stronger than this, Kael. You are not a monster." With a surge of defiance, Kael grabbed his sword and stood, his eyes burning with resolve. "No," he growled, his voice steady despite the fear in his heart. "I am not like you." The reflection snarled, its face contorting with rage. "You can't stop this." But Kael knew, in that moment, what the reflection was. A manifestation of his fear, his doubt, his darkest impulses. It was a part of him, but it did not define him. "You're right," Kael said, his voice calm now. "The hunger is a part of me, but it doesn't control me. I do." With a swift movement, Kael plunged his sword into the reflection's chest. The mirrored version of him gasped, its red eyes widening in shock as the blade sank deep into its heart. For a moment, the reflection stood frozen, its mouth opening and closing as if trying to speak. And then, slowly, it began to dissolve, its form breaking apart into shimmering shards of glass that scattered across the abyss. As the reflection vanished, the void around Kael shifted, the oppressive darkness lifting. The abyss of mirrors shimmered once more, but now it was silent, still. Kael stood alone, his breath coming in slow, steady gasps. The battle was over, but he knew the true fight was still ahead. He had learned one thing, though: he could face the darkness inside him, but it would take more than strength to defeat the god who had cursed his bloodline. Yseult's words echoed in his mind. "The key to breaking the curse lies within you, but it requires a terrible sacrifice." Kael's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. He now understood what that sacrifice might be. But was he ready to pay it? The journey to Tharon's temple was a descent into darkness. Kael and Yseult traveled through lands forgotten by time, where ancient ruins jutted from the earth like the bones of dead gods, and the sky itself seemed to weep with the weight of untold horrors. The ground was scorched and barren, and the air reeked of ash and decay, a fitting realm for the slumbering deity of bloodfire. The closer they got to the temple, the more Kael felt the curse within him stirring. The bloodlust, once a constant gnawing at the back of his mind, now surged through his veins with terrifying intensity. Every heartbeat felt like a drumbeat in a war he could not escape. His vision blurred at times, and he could hear the whispering voices of his ancestors, calling to him, urging him to give in. Yseult walked beside him in silence, her face grim. She could sense the tension building in Kael, the inner struggle that had become a visible storm. She had warned him of what was to come, but there were no more words left to say. Now, all that remained was the final confrontation, the moment when Kael would either break free of his cursed fate or be consumed by it forever. As they reached the entrance of the temple, Kael paused, staring at the massive stone doors before him. They were engraved with symbols of blood and flame, the mark of Tharon, god of bloodfire. The air around the temple crackled with an unnatural energy, and Kael could feel the deity's presence, vast and malevolent, pressing down on him. "This is where it ends," Yseult said softly, her eyes fixed on the doors. "Once you enter, there is no turning back." Kael nodded, his jaw clenched. He had come too far to hesitate now. He could feel the pull of the bloodlust stronger than ever, but he forced himself to focus. This was his last chance to break the curse, to end the torment that had plagued his clan for generations. With a deep breath, Kael pushed open the doors. Inside, the temple was bathed in an eerie red light. The walls were lined with ancient statues of warriors, their eyes hollow, their hands gripping swords drenched in blood. At the far end of the chamber stood the altar, and behind it, looming over everything, was a massive figure carved from black stone. Tharon, the god who had cursed his bloodline. As Kael approached, the air grew heavier, and the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. The statue's eyes began to glow with a fiery red light, and the temperature in the room rose sharply. Kael could feel the heat on his skin, but it wasn't just the physical warmth. It was the curse, flaring up within him, reacting to the presence of its master. Suddenly, the room was filled with a deep, resonant voice, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Kael Blood-Red, the voice boomed, shaking the very foundations of the temple. You have come at last, the last of your line, seeking to defy your fate. Kael's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood firm, staring up at the towering statue. I'm here to break the curse, he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. It ends with me. There was a moment of silence, and then the statue began to move. Slowly, it came to life, the stone shifting and cracking as it took on the form of the god himself. Tharon was immense, his body wreathed in flames, his eyes burning with a malevolent red light. He stepped down from the altar, each footfall sending tremors through the ground. Break the curse, Tharon laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. Foolish mortal, you do not understand. The curse cannot be broken. It is a bond, forged in blood, sealed by your ancestors' greed. It is eternal. Kael's hands tightened on the hilt of his sword. There must be a way. Tharon's burning eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. There is no escape from what you are, Kael. The curse is your birthright. It flows in your veins, in the blood of your ancestors. You cannot undo what has been done. You can only choose to accept it or pass it on. Kael's breath caught in his throat. Pass it on, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tharon grinned, his fangs gleaming in the firelight. Yes, the curse may be transferred, given to another, a willing sacrifice, someone to take your place. Or you may embrace it, accept your nature, and become what you were always meant to be, immortal, powerful, free of your mortal limitations. Kael felt a wave of disgust rise within him. I will never pass this curse on to anyone else, he spat, his voice filled with defiance. And I won't become the monster you want me to be. Tharon's grin faded, replaced by a look of cold fury. Then you are a fool, bound by the same weakness that doomed your clan. You think you can defy me? You think you can fight your fate? Kael raised his sword, his resolve hardening. I will fight you, and I will win. Tharon's eyes blazed with fire as he raised one massive hand, flames swirling around his fingers. Then come, mortal, face the wrath of a god. With a roar, Tharon unleashed a torrent of fire, and Kael barely had time to dive out of the way as the flames scorched the ground where he had stood. The heat was unbearable, and Kael could feel the bloodlust inside him surging, demanding to be fed. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he felt the urge to give in, to let the hunger take control. But he couldn't. Not now. Not when everything was at stake. Kael charged at Tharon, his sword glowing with the light of the runes Yseult had inscribed upon it. The god swung his massive arm at Kael, but Kael was quick, dodging the blow and striking back with all his strength. His blade sliced through the flames, cutting into Tharon's flesh, and the god roared in pain and fury. "You dare to strike me?" Tharon bellowed, his voice shaking the temple. "You are nothing compared to me." Kael gritted his teeth, his muscles burning with the effort of each strike. "I am not nothing," he growled, slashing at Tharon again. "I am the last of my clan, and I will end this." The battle raged on. Each strike of Kael's sword met with the searing heat of Tharon's flames. But with every blow, Kael could feel himself weakening. The bloodlust was growing stronger, gnawing at his mind, whispering promises of power, of release. His movements became more erratic, his vision clouded by a red haze. "Give in," Tharon hissed, his voice echoing in Kael's mind. "You cannot win. The hunger is too strong. Let it consume you." Kael stumbled, falling to one knee as his grip on his sword faltered. The bloodlust was overwhelming now, a roaring tide of hunger that threatened to drown him. He could feel the beast inside him clawing at the surface, demanding to be released. "Embrace it," Tharon whispered. "Become what you were always meant to be." Kael's vision blurred, and for a moment, he teetered on the edge. The hunger was so strong, the promise of power so tempting. He could end the pain, the struggle, if he just gave in. But then, in the midst of the chaos, Kael heard another voice, a soft, familiar voice. "Yseult, remember who you are." Kael's eyes snapped open, and with a surge of determination, he pushed the bloodlust back. It took everything he had, every ounce of willpower, but he managed to rise to his feet, his sword still in hand. "I am not your puppet," Kael growled, his voice raw but filled with defiance. With a final roar, Kael charged at Tharon once more, his sword glowing brighter than ever before. Tharon raised his hand to strike, but Kael was faster. In one swift, decisive move, Kael plunged his sword deep into Tharon's chest, driving the blade into the heart of the god. Tharon's eyes widened in shock, his flames flickering as his form began to waver. "No, this cannot be," the god rasped, his voice filled with disbelief. "You, a mere mortal." Kael twisted the blade, and Tharon let out a final, earth-shaking roar as his body began to dissolve, the flames consuming him from within. The ground trembled, and the temple walls cracked as the god of bloodfire was consumed by his own power. As Tharon's form vanished into the ether, the room grew silent. The oppressive heat faded, and the air was still. Kael stood there, panting, his body trembling with exhaustion. The bloodlust was still there, but it had quieted. He had won. But as he stood in the silence of the ruined temple, he knew that the battle was not yet over. Kael stood amidst the crumbling temple, the remains of Tharon dissipating into the void, but the silence that followed was not one of victory. The bloodlust still surged within him, an insatiable force gnawing at his soul, demanding to be fed. He had struck down the god, but his curse was far from broken. The temple's red glow began to fade, the shadows lengthening as Kael stumbled forward. His vision swam, and he could feel the darkness closing in. Each breath was a struggle, each heartbeat a reminder of the hunger clawing inside him. "I cannot hold on much longer," he thought, despair washing over him. The beast inside, once a whisper, had become a roar, and Kael knew he was moments from losing himself completely. As he faltered, a hand caught his arm. He looked up to see Yseult, her eyes filled with an intensity he had not seen before. "Kael," she whispered, her voice soft but resolute. "You must fight it. You are stronger than this." But Kael shook his head, his breath ragged. "It's too late. The hunger, it's consuming me." His voice was laced with anguish, and he could feel the beast's fangs closing in on his mind, eager to devour what little humanity remained. Yseult's grip tightened. "It's never too late. Not while you still have a choice." Before he could respond, Yseult took a step back and closed her eyes. She began to chant in the ancient druidic tongue, her voice rising above the suffocating darkness in the temple. The air around her shimmered with power, and a soft, golden light began to envelop her form. Kael's eyes widened in confusion and fear. "Yseult, what are you doing?" But Yseult didn't answer. She simply opened her eyes, filled with both sorrow and determination, and stepped toward Kael, her hand outstretched. "I cannot let you fall," she whispered. "Your soul is worth saving." Before Kael could react, Yseult pressed her hand to his chest, and a searing pain shot through his body. He gasped, feeling the bloodlust inside him flare violently, as if the beast had been struck. Yseult's light intensified, and suddenly Kael understood. She was drawing the darkness from him, pulling the curse into herself. "No!" Kael shouted, reaching for her, but it was too late. Yseult's eyes glazed over, her body trembling as she absorbed the full force of the curse's power. The temple trembled with the sheer weight of the energy being transferred, and Kael could only watch in horror as the light that surrounded her flickered and began to fade. Yseult staggered, her face pale, but still, she smiled at Kael. "Now you have a chance," she whispered. "Do not waste it." With those final words, Yseult's body crumbled, the golden light dimming as she collapsed at Kael's feet. Kael's heart shattered. Yseult, the only ally he had left, had sacrificed herself to save him. The bloodlust that had nearly consumed him was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness, an aching loss that cut deeper than any wound. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he gently touched her lifeless form. Tears blurred his vision. Yseult! But there was no time for grief. As Kael knelt beside her, the temple shuddered once more. The ground split open, and from the cracks emerged the dying embers of Tharon's power, an echo of the god's wrath, now unleashed upon the world in a final act of vengeance. Kael rose, fury and sorrow twisting together inside him. Yseult's sacrifice had saved his soul, but now it was up to him to finish what she had begun. His grip tightened on his sword, and with renewed determination, he stepped toward the altar, where Tharon's essence still lingered like a poisonous cloud. As the shadows of the temple coalesced into the form of the dying god, Tharon's voice rasped through the air. "You think you've won, mortal? The curse, lives, cannot be undone." Kael raised his sword, his eyes burning with a resolve born from pain. "No," he said, his voice steady, "but I can contain it." With a fierce cry, Kael plunged his sword into the heart of the altar, invoking the ancient power that Yseult had spoken of. The runes along the blade glowed with a brilliant light, and the temple was consumed by a blinding flash. Tharon's essence howled as it was drawn into the sword, sealed away within its blade, bound to Kael's will. The ground beneath him trembled one final time before settling into stillness. The temple was silent, its oppressive heat gone. Tharon was no more, his power now locked within the blade. But the curse remained. It had not been broken. Kael stood alone in the ruins, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He glanced down at Yseult's lifeless form, his chest tight with grief. She had given everything to save him, to give him a chance at redemption. And now the blood of his ancestors, the curse of the Blood-Red clan, was his burden to bear. He sheathed the sword, the weight of it now heavier than ever before. The hunger had been quelled, but it was not gone. It would never be gone. Kael understood that now. The curse could not be broken, but it could be controlled, contained. And it was Kael's duty to ensure that it would never consume anyone else. He was the last of the Blood-Red, the lone guardian of the curse, condemned to fight against the hunger within him for eternity. As he left the temple behind, Kael cast one final glance at the ruins of his past. His journey had not ended in victory, but in acceptance. The blood of his ancestors still ran through his veins, and the curse would forever be his to bear. But with Yseult's sacrifice, he had found something far more precious than power. He had found the strength to defy his fate. And so, Kael Blood-Red, the last of his line, walked into the night, a solitary figure bound by blood, but no longer defined by it.